we will discuss about fiscal deficit. Okay, fiscal deficit. See, fiscal deficit means it's actually borrowings only. So you can write the technical definition, then I will explain what you mean by this borrowing. Okay, just write the technical definition. It is the excess of total expenditure of the government. It is the excess of total expenditure of the government over its total receipts. Total expenditure over its total receipts other than borrowings. Other than borrowings during a financial year. During a financial year. So it is the excess of total expenditure of the government over its total receipts other than borrowings during a financial year. So total expenditure minus total receipts except borrowings. Okay, so total receipts, receipts, borrowing will also come. If you remember in the previous session I've told you, in the receipts it's something which you are receiving, right? So in that borrowings will also come, so that will be excluded here. So ultimately what does it mean? It means the borrowings only. So fiscal deficit is actually the borrowings. Okay, or if you see here, fiscal deficit is what I've told you is total expenditure minus you can see the receipts. There are two types, right? Revenue receipts plus, see, borrowing will come under where? Capital receipts or revenue receipts? Where the borrowings will come?
Capital receipt.
Why it will come in capital receipts?
Because
it's a liability. It's a liability, right? So it will come under capital receipts. So can I say total expenditure minus entire revenue receipts will come? Now from total expenditure minus total receipts except borrowing. So total expenditure is done. Now I need to talk about total receipts minus borrowing. So total receipts means what? Revenue receipts plus capital receipts, right? This is what your total receipts. But from capital receipts only what I need to exclude? Borrowing. So can I write revenue receipts completely here? Yes, I can write. Okay, then plus from the capital receipts what you need to add is the non-debt creating capital receipts. Okay, debt creating capital receipt is actually borrowing. So just write here non-debt creating capital receipt. Do you understand what I mean by this? See, simple term, fiscal deficit means what? Fiscal deficit means total expenditure minus total receipts excluding the borrowing part, right? So total expenditure, exactly that I've written. Now total receipts minus borrowing is what I need. So total receipt is nothing but revenue receipt and capital receipt. So borrowing will come in capital receipt. So I can write the revenue receipt here, and from capital receipt I need to exclude borrowing. So I can say non-debt creating capital receipt, or I'll show you in this way also. When we discuss about budget, I've told you, you have receipts and you have expenditure. So receipts are of two types, right? Revenue receipt and also capital receipt. In this we have discussed related to assets increasing and or assets decreasing and liability also. This we have discussed, right? Asset and liability related part. Now in expenditure, what are the two types? Revenue expenditure, capital expenditure. Okay, so when we talking about fiscal deficit, what we have done here, if you see this total expenditure I have taken, right? So that is what? Total expenditure. Then minus what I have done here, I am taking revenue receipts from the receipt side. So what I will take? I will take this part, no? Revenue receipts. This I will take, correct? And then so minus revenue receipt, and then from here can I take it completely? No. What I need to exclude here? This liability portion I need to exclude, right? So I will take this assets only, this only, non-debt creating. Why it is non-debt creating? If you turn your page back, I have told you it is related to the disinvestment or selling of assets, etc. These are not creating any debt. But liability, what we have discussed, the borrowing. So this is the borrowing part. So we exclude this. So this part will come. That is what you mean by non-debt creating. Non-debt creating asset, okay, or non-debt creating capital receipt. So I hope this is clear. So total expenditure minus total receipt, in that you exclude borrowing. So ultimately fiscal deficit means what? Fiscal deficit is actually the borrowing. To meet the fiscal deficit, only you are actually borrowing. Okay, so that is why fiscal deficit can be understood as borrowing. Just write one line. It measures total borrowings of the government. It measures total borrowings of the government from all sources, during a financial year. During a financial year. It is the most comprehensive concept of budgetary deficits. It is the most comprehensive concept of budgetary deficits. Okay, one more point you can write. Its impact on economic development. Its impact on economic development depends on the use of borrowed funds. Its impact on economic development depends on the use of borrowed funds. Okay, one more line. This point we will discuss in detail later. We will discuss about FRBM Act. Okay, so just write one more line which is connected to fiscal deficit here. As per the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, as per the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, FRBMA 2003, the government have to reduce fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP or less by 2008. 3% or less by 2008. Okay, I'll tell you how you will write this or how you will see this this fiscal deficit. It's like this. First you will see the previous year. Let's say previous year is 2018-19, right? Or what I have data is actually 2015-16. So this is how generally you will see. So 2015-16. So here you will get the actual data of last year, one column. Okay, then you will go for current year, that is 19-20, right? So current year will be like 2000. Let's say here it is 2015-16 is taken. So imagine current year is 2016-17, and then it will be 2016-17. There will be two estimates. One will be the budget estimate. Okay, that will be in Feb, and then there will be a revised estimate. I'm coming to 2018-19 and all, but I'll tell you how you are writing it. This is how you will see when you are reading this budget and everything in future. Okay, so to 2016-17, so current year you will see budget estimate and revised estimate. Then you will also see next year. So there will be a budget estimate, right? Next year will be in this context 2017-18. So here also you will have only one column, that is budget estimate. So you can see here, if you see here, three columns, right? So this is the previous year. So this is previous year. So here you will be getting the actual data. Actual data will be available, whatever it is, fiscal deficit, actual data will be available. So here you have two, budget estimate and then revised estimate. So let's say this is 3.5, actual value only, and revised also it was 3.5, and the estimate for next year it was 3.2%. Okay, now it will definitely increase now. Now see here, next year what will happen? This will become the current year, right? Next year this will become the current year. So what will come in the middle? 2017-18, and in that there will be a budget estimate and there will be a revised estimate. Okay, and then what will happen with this? Then this will become the previous year, right? So this is how you will see then. So 2016-17 will become the previous year, and here you will get the actual data. This is previous year, this is current year. So you will get the actual data here. You will get the actual data, and then 2018-19, this is the next year. So what will be this column? This is the budget estimate. So you can see here, previous year you will get the actual data, correct one. Here there will be two, budget estimate and revised estimate, and then here for next year budget estimate. So what will be the case of next year? You will just extend, right? Next year what will happen? This will become the current year, then this will become the previous year. So here you will get the actual data. These two will not be there, only this will be there. Here you will have a revised estimate, and then you will have a next year, that is 2019-20, that is the budget estimate. So this is how you will see the values which will be represented. So these are the values which I have given, and we will update it later. Towards the end of this module I can update all these values. So right now just take down these this idea. This is how you will write. Okay, now the next topic is adverse impact. Now zero based budget we always follow. That is a method of budgeting. No, every time if you are allocating fund, it is based on that. Sometimes you will follow, sometimes you may not follow. So here the adverse impact of fiscal deficit. First one, what is the most important one? Fiscal deficit means what? We understood it is borrowing. So when borrowing increase means what? Liability will increase. So liability means ultimately it is the public debt. Just write one line. It increases public debt. It increases public debt. It increases public debt, which increases future interest liabilities. Okay, so here public debt increasing means what? You need to pay the interest also. So it will increase interest liabilities. See, actually there is a problem. If this government keep on borrowing, what will happen? This interest liability will fall on whom? The next government, right? So there has to be intergovernmental or intergenerational equity, and all that question is there. That is the reason why FRBM Act is mainly there. So public debt, the government can borrow, the government can spend for the welfare expenditures and all, but what will happen? It will increase the public debt and interest liabilities for the future government. Okay, so that is the main problem. So that intergenerational equity has to be balanced or maintained. That is the actual reason for FRBM Act. So now interest liability increase means what will happen? You can write one more line continuously to with that, which adversely affect developmental expenditure. Which will adversely affect developmental expenditure, because in future the developmental expenditure will be affected very badly. Second point, it creates inflation. It create inflation. How it create inflation? See, it create inflation. Yeah, 4 to, that is the optimal ratio according to us for as of now. It has to be reduced later also. It has to be reduced to 0 later. At this point of time, we need to gradually come down. So at this point of time, that 3, 4, that range is actually considered better. But this year, obviously, it will be high, and we are going for higher fiscal deficit, obviously, for this year, for the because of this issues of corona and all. Okay, the fiscal deficit will be so high in this year. Okay, a lot of fiscal stimulus and measures has already been taken place, so obviously it will go high. We will see that. Now, in which context inflation will go high? Inflation will go high because, see, this is actually borrowing. So when this term fiscal deficit is coming to you, you just understand it is nothing but borrowing. Now, why government is borrowing? Government is borrowing only for spending. It is ultimately coming to the market only. It is coming to the public, and it is coming to the public domain. So what will happen? It will increase money supply. Money supply increasing means the prices will increase. That lead to money supply increase means demand increase. So price increase, that lead to inflation. So it is highly inflationary. When you borrow, when the government keep on borrowing, it is highly inflationary. And why when the government keep on borrowing, the interest rate also keep on increasing? Why? Because when the government keep on borrowing, Ultimately, there is a demand for money. So when the demand for money increase, price for money will also increase. In that way, you can say interest rate will increase. Okay, there is a demand for money. Demand for money means price for money. What is the price for money? That is the interest only. So interest will increase. So when the government borrowing is high, the interest will increase. Secondly, when the government borrow, there is an inflation. When inflation is there, the RBI central bank will increase what? Repo or policy rate. So in that context also inflation will increase. So not inflation, interest rate will increase. So what I'm saying is, when the government borrowing is high, or even fiscal deficit is high, you can say that, or when the borrowing is high, automatically interest will be high, because borrowing means more demand for money. More demand for money means the price for money will go up. Price for money is actually interest, so interest will increase. Secondly, when government borrow, what will happen? Inflation will be there. To tackle inflation, the RBI have to reduce money supply, so RBI will increase the interest rate. So this will actually happen at the demand supply equation. This will happen from the impact of central bank policy. So interest rate will definitely go up, and this was actually a prelims question. Okay, so very important question or very important concept. You should have a very clear idea about this. When the government borrow, interest rate will go up. Next point you write, it leads to crowding out. This was crowding out. Just write what is crowding out. Crowding out refers to reduction in private expenditure. This was actually the question. Reduction in private expenditure, or no, don't write private expenditure, write private investment. Reduction in private investment due to increase in interest rates. Due to increase in interest rates as a result of excessive borrowing. So I hope you understood why this interest rate is increasing. Interest rate is increasing because of excessive borrowing. So what I'm saying is, fiscal deficit means borrowing. Borrowing increase means what? Interest rates will increase. Interest rate will increase means private investment will decrease. That is what crowding out. Okay, see, RBI increase repo, right? RBI increase repo. In that context also, interest is high, so private investment will decrease. But this is not crowding out. Crowding out, you have to understand it specific to the government borrowing. Okay, because of excess government borrowing, when the interest rates are increasing, that is what crowding out. It is connected to government borrowing. But here I have discussed with you, like inflation is there. Inflation is there simply because of demand supply equation. Inflation is there. RBI increase repo. So obviously what will happen? Interest rate will increase. So private investment will come down. This is not crowding out. Crowding out, when I am discussing from the perspective of government borrowing is increasing. So with the government borrowing, when the interest rate is increasing, when the private investment will come down, that's what crowding out. So for anything, there will be an opposite also, right? There will be crowding in. What do you think will be crowding in? Not in this context. Generally, what do you think will be crowding in then? Crowding in is government promote private investment. Okay, so how government can promote private investment? Government can actually increase in public expenditure. Okay, increase in public expenditure. So like that is in terms of infrastructure. Like government create the infrastructure, government provide the infrastructure, and then companies will come, private investment will also increase. That is crowding in situation. Okay, so understand, when we talk about crowding out, RBI is increasing interest rate, and that is not related to that. Okay, so this is related to fiscal deficit. This is related to borrowing. Crowding out is essentially related to borrowing of the government. It is not any way interest in the increase in the interest rate. Interest rate can be increased if RBI directly increasing the policy rate. That context also interest rate will go high. So that is not crowding out. Okay, so it's like this. One more time I'll tell you, fiscal deficit is increasing means what? Demand for money or demand for fund will increase. Demand for fund will increase means price for fund will increase. Price for fund is what actually? Interest. So interest will increase. Okay, interest will increase means what? Investment, private investment will decrease. You can see here, let's say this is the demand supply curve. So this is a demand for fund, this is a supply for fund. So on x-axis I will go for funds, and this is a cost of fund, that is interest. I am expecting that all of you can understand this diagram. Maybe Sahar and Anjali may face some problem. Otherwise, okay, you can understand demand supply. So demand curve and supply curve, right? Demand curve look downward, supply curve look upward. So this is the equilibrium position. So this is a demand of fund, this is a supply of fund. So what will happen when the government borrowing increase? Demand for fund will increase, right? Demand for fund will increase. So you can see here automatically interest is increasing. So this is how theoretically I can show you how interest is increasing. Okay, if this is actually happening, that is what you call as crowding out. Okay, okay. So right, one more point you can write there. It increases vulnerability of the domestic economy. It increases vulnerability of the domestic economy from economic shocks. From economic shocks, as it reduces capacity of the government, as it reduces capacity of the government to intervene in the economy, to intervene in the economy to overcome such shocks. It increases vulnerability of the domestic economy from economic shocks as it reduces the capacity of government to intervene in the economy to overcome such shocks, like because of fiscal deficit. Okay, so again I'm telling you, fiscal deficit is what? It is total expenditure minus total receipts, but not including borrowing. Total receipts include revenue receipts and capital receipts. So from capital receipts I need to exclude borrowing, or the debt creating capital receipts I need to exclude. So total expenditure, then revenue receipts, okay, and then plus what I need to add? From the capital receipt part I cannot add borrowing. Except borrowing I can add the non-debt creating capital receipts. This I can do. Okay, so what is this non-debt creating capital asset? This is what I have told you in the last class, that this is related to disinvestment, okay, or selling of assets, government selling assets, or sale of idle lands which are not using. Okay, all these are non-debt creating. But capital receipt, why capital receipt? You are receiving money. Why capital? Because your assets are reducing. Obviously assets are reducing, so it is capital. But there is no liability here. Okay, now tell me, if you understood this, you can tell me correctly what all things you need to do to reduce fiscal deficit, or what should be the fiscal reforms, right? There can be two ways. What is the first thing that you can do? With respect to total expenditure, what you can do? Mainly, what is the main overall thing that you can do with respect to expenditure? Increase or decrease?
Reduce it.
Reduce the expenditure. So when we talk about expenditure reform, you have to reduce the expenditure. So what all measures you can do to reduce the expenditure? So what you need to see, what are the expenditures? We have seen different expenditures, mainly revenue expenditure. We have seen a lot of expenditure. Okay, so what you can write here, what all things you will write here? Like mainly decrease the subsidies. Okay, then you give in terms of DBT, direct benefit transfer, so that you can avoid the leakages and all. Then various austerity measures. Austerity measures means again for reducing the expenditure, like when the officials are traveling, instead of air travel, in case of first class air travel, you can go for economy travel. 5-star meetings, Okay, that can be normal meetings, etc. So that is what you mean by austerity measures. Then new pension scheme, we have already discussed this in financial inclusion in detail, how the other previous pension was a burden for the government. Fiscal burden, that word is what we have used, fiscal burden, but here it is contributory pension scheme. So how it is actually solving the fiscal burden of the government, we have discussed. Okay, so NPS 2004 national pension system we have discussed. So these are you can say various expenditure reforms. What about this side? With respect to revenue, what you can do? Revenue, what you need to do? Increase revenue. Mainly these are the two things that you need to do. No, you increase revenue or reduce expenditure. This is what you need to do ultimately to reduce the deficit. Deficit is this difference, expenditure minus receipts. So either decrease the expenditure, this side has to be decreased, or increase this revenue part. Okay, so what all things you can do to increase revenue? You can go for tax reform. Okay, like GAAR, General Anti-Avoidance Rule. I will discuss this in the chapter of taxation. General Anti-Avoidance Rule, DTAA, Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement. Okay, so these are something, GST, all these you can write. Then reforms in PSUs, because I have told you one of the most important source of revenue receipt that we have discussed is from the profit of PSUs. So reform in PSU. Similarly, when we discussed about PSU, I have told you departmental undertakings, right? We discussed about post, we discussed about railways, etc. So reform in departmental undertakings also. Okay, and then disinvestment, you can write that also, disinvestment. Okay, so these are the ways in which you can reduce the fiscal deficit. So understanding what is fiscal deficit is what more important for us. So fiscal deficit means excess of expenditure and receipts except borrowing. So in this way you can understand it in detail. One more time I'll tell you, fiscal deficit is actually equal to expenditure minus receipts except borrowing. So expenditure, total expenditure. This is total receipts minus borrowing. So what I need to do? Total expenditure, I can say total expenditure minus total receipts. In that revenue receipts and capital receipts will come. I can take this completely. So revenue receipt. From capital receipts, I need to exclude what? I need to exclude borrowing part. So what I can write is revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital assets. Now, next concept. Third one, so budget deficit we have done, then fiscal deficit we have done, revenue deficit. Revenue deficit.